Right, well, welcome to the second day of our conference on Fellini Italy cinema. And to start the proceeding, let us start with the usual U of T land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. At the beginning, we would also like to thank our sponsors who have supported this conference, specifically the Goggio Chair in Italian Studies, the Cinema Studies Institute, the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Toronto, and the Department of Italian Studies. Also, as you know, just a little reminder, this is the first of two conferences on celebrating the centennial of Fellini's birth. The second conference will take place in Rome on January 20th and 21st of 2021. Another sort of annuncio di servizio, so to speak. Day one of the conference is now on the departmental YouTube channel. So if you missed anything, you can watch it at your leisure. And I believe that you should find the link on the chat. And last but not least, I just wanted to remind everyone to mute their mics during the papers. Okay, very well. So now that we're done with the shall we say the preliminaries. It's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Frank Burke, whom you all know as one of the foremost Felliniani, one of the foremost scholars of Fellini specifically and of Italian cinema in general. But let me just say a couple of words about Professor Burke, who is Professor Emeritus at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He has published 5 books on Fellini, 2 of which just came out this year. One is the companion, a companion to Federico Fellini, which he edited with the late Margaret Waller and Marita Kubarieva, and his own Fellini's films and commercials from post-war to postmodern, published by Intellect and the University of Chicago Press. He has also provided the audio commentary along with the late Peter Brunetta for the Criterion Collection release of Fellini's Amarcord, as well as solo commentaries for Criterion's release of Fellini's Roma and forthcoming release of Il Bidone. All 3 will be included in the Criterion's box soon to appear, in fact, set to appear next month. His non-Fellini publications again include numerous works, among which a companion to Italian cinema published in 2017 by Wiley Blackwell, and he has written on the Italian peplum, on Dario Argento, Michelangelo Antonioni, Dina Vermeuler, Mario Camerini, Roberto Rossellini, and many, many other subjects, including such things as horror cinema and Sam Peckinpah, ranging outside of Italian cinema as well. Along with Amy Hugh Dugdale and Marita Gubarieva, he's preparing a special issue of the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies on Tonino Guerra, for whom 2020 is also a centenary year. And finally, he's editing a section on Fellini for the journal Italica. There's a slight change to the program. The original title of his paper was Dreams, Death, and Enchantment, the Fellinian Melancholic. But as he will explain, the more recent title is the Fellinian Symbolic / Oneiric. Professor Burke.
All right, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. And I will now try and do my screen. I think my PowerPoint's up on screen and everything now. All right, this is good.
I can see it. Yeah.
Frank's first attempt at PowerPoint and Zoom. Thank you very much, Luca, and thank you all for this wonderful conference and occasion. Today's talk is part of a larger project that will ultimately focus on Fellini's Il Libro dei Sogni. And thinking about his compilation of dream sketches and annotations, I came to the conclusion that before addressing the text itself, as well as matters of representation. I also realized that the Oneiric was in turn part of a larger complex of Fellinian issues and strategies embracing the numinous and the symbolic. The former comprises experiences that exceed rational apprehension and speak to the entire cognitive and emotive apparatus of the experient, evoking feelings of mystery, awe, spiritual awakening, and empathy, feelings often termed religious. The latter may or may not be numinous in effect, while symbols in a Jungian sense may incite and excite, opening themselves out to multiple interpretations and non-conceptual responses. Cultural symbols, including rituals, generally function as a form of ideological prescription and control. The symbolic is more encompassing than the numinous, and I'll consider it my umbrella term to address both not only its various occurrences, but also their changing nature in relation to changes in Fellini's life and creative trajectory. I'd also hope to talk a bit about melancholy, which people are beginning to recognize as a significant characteristic of Fellini's work, linking it to the Oneiric and also to caricature and parody. But I won't have time. I just found out 2 weeks ago that I only have 30 minutes, so I've had to cut things down. And I'll try not to be too Trumpian and go too far beyond those 30 minutes. I'll also skip a couple of films and Fellini's Banco di Roma dream commercials and be very brief in talking of Fellini's final work. And last of all, I'm moving in a new direction. I'm also doubling back over some familiar ground in terms of my earlier writings. And I hope that familiarity will not breed contempt. I've come to distinguish among 6 principal phases of the symbolic or the symbolic/Oneiric in Fellini's work. First, the dominantly cultural as opposed to person-centered symbolic. Second, an emerging, though pre-Jungian capacity on the part of Fellini's characters for personal symbolic activity. Third, a relatively short-lived Jungian phase of person-centered in what I term teleological psychology. Fourth, a moment in which Jungian person-centeredness becomes contested and displaced, though not discarded. Fifth, the post-Jungian, post-teleological phase. And sixth, the concluding postmodern, post-psychological phase. There is inevitably a reasonable amount of boundary crossing among these phases, as well, no doubt, as room for more precise differentiation among them. The centrality of Jung to this discussion has less to do with Jungian elements of personality development, for example, anima, animus, persona, and so forth, than with the purposive aspect of Jungian dream analysis. In contrast to Freud, who felt the dreams were neurotic symptoms linked to wish fulfillment and sexuality, Jung saw dreams in the life of the imagination as crucial to the process of individuation, to elevating unconscious material to a level of consciousness and achieving personality integration. I identify as Jungian or proto-Jungian those instances of Fellini's work in which dream life reveals a purposive aim, even if the aim is not ultimately realized. I consider post-Jungian those Fellini films that seem to abandon teleological promise. In addressing the latter, I will invoke the work of James Hillman, a post-Jungian psychoanalyst with whose work Fellini was familiar. Whoops, we went up. There we go. All right, my first section is the cultural symbolic, the development of subjectivity, and the pre-Jungian psychological. Although strong subjectivities and a personal unconscious emerge rather quickly in Fellini's career, his first 2 films, Luci del Varietà and Lo Cieco Bianco, present dreams, and here I'm using the word even in the broad sense, of goals, aspirations, desires, and related fantasies, as entirely constructed. In Variety Lights, the title implies it all, the myth of celebrity, one's name in lights. In The White Sheik, they're the myths of the Vatican and bourgeois propriety that shape Ivan's consciousness, and the fantasy of the chic and the photoromanzi that shape Vanda's. The symbolic, for example, the angel at the end of the white sheik. And the sheik is a virtual statue himself at times, is meant to suture people into existing power and fantasy structures. It is disempowering and centripetal, as opposed to the creative symbolism prized by Jung and Fellini, which is centrifugal and charged with empowering and individualizing energy rather than merely with signification. In the absence of meaningful subjectivity, the numinous, the truly Oneiric, and the symbolically enabling cannot exist. However, while subjectivity is subjected in Fellini's first two films, there are intimations of something more on the part of Vanda. Her fantasies drive the film's narrative, and though they are socially determined, they invade the so-called objective mise-en-scène through numerous instances of free and direct discourse, the fusion of a seemingly objective reality with the character's point of view. The initial appearance of the sheik, illogically high on a swing in the forest, is an example of reality infused with Vanda's wonder. The first strong signals of person-centered symbolic subjectivity in Fellini's opus manifest themselves in La Strada. Even the rather brutish Zampano decorates his motorhome with evocative symbols that hint at a consciousness struggling to express itself. And his strongman routine, the breaking of a chain with his pectoral muscles or heart, is a metaphoric representation of a nascent urge to love. Gelsomina is an intuitively creative magnet for the numinous. All the world is alive to her senses: the sea, trees, telephone poles, stones, the mysterious Osvaldo. Sorry, I skipped one of my slides. There, it's Gelsomina. She may be forced into a socially pre-established role dressed as a clown, but she brings her own inventive flair and comedy to her interpolation. Ultimately, her initiative and uniqueness will be defeated by pressures to accept her lot with Zampano, largely through the quote-unquote angelic Il Matto, a representative in my reading of the film of the culturally determined at its most debilitating. La Strada is, in a sense, the first film in which Fellini discovers his own unconscious. He has described La Strada as, quote, a complete catalog of my entire mythological world, a dangerous representation of my identity, unquote. And he has noted, quote, the roots from which Gelsomina and Zampano were born reach deep into a profound and dark place populated by a sense of guilt, by fear. Because of the psychologically loaded nature of the subject matter, Fellini suffered, as he called it, a sort of psychic Chernobyl. This led him to sessions with a Freudian psychoanalyst, Emilio Servadio, whose methodology Fellini did not embrace, but who in all likelihood fueled Fellini's fascination with the unconscious. The mythic and psychological dimension of La Strada is not Jungian or Freudian in any schematic way. Fellini's films will never be psychoanalytically schematic. Nonetheless, hybridizing Freud and Jung, we can talk in general terms of Zampano as an id figure, Il Matto as a superego, and Gelsomina as a nascent individuating self that is destroyed from below the id and above the superego. While La Strada signals the potential emergence of creative consciousness, hence the profoundly psychological within Fellini, Il Bidone is about its suppression. However, the very insistence with which the protagonist Augusto refuses to acknowledge his soul-numbing life makes consciousness and its absence central to the movie. One interesting moment in a Jungian direction is the importance of anima figures. Augusto's daughter Patrizia and the partially paralyzed Susanna, who in a sense replaces Patrizia near the film's end. The anima in Jungian psychology refers to the hidden feminine side and soul of the male, his feelings, his connectivity. Augusto's failed relation to Patrizia and Susanna suggests his inability to love and connect. On the other hand, Augusto is as alienated from the cultural symbolic as he is from himself. The principal scam that he and his fellow thieves enact dressing as priests, burying worthless treasure on farmland, that exacting payment from farm folk for masses for the soul of the murderer who supposedly buried the treasure, is a travesty of Catholicism, spirituality, death and resurrection, and even capitalism. Augusto's marginalization from Italian Catholic society is part of a culture versus individual dynamic in Fellini's early work, in which rejection of the first contributes to the liberation of the second. Accordingly, the promise offered by La Strada becomes realized in the film that follows upon Il Bidone, Le Notti di Cabiria, which offers a nascent Jungian vision of psychological development. The heroine evolves from unreflective experience to ego awareness of self and world, then to the creation of a new identity, Maria in quotes / Cabiria, that combines youthful innocence and the wisdom of experience. At film's end, she undergoes a symbolic death and rebirth that concludes with a rather magical and paradisal existence in a world of not just spirit, but full integrated selfhood. Central to her evolution is a scene in which, under hypnosis, she descends into her unconscious and oneirically connects culture, such things as the normativity of marriage, economic plenitude, and religious transcendence into psycho-spiritual forms of unity, fullness of being, and personal transformation. The fact that Fellini renders an evolutionary psychological process that is highly compatible with Jungian dream psychoanalysis is quite remarkable because he'd not yet encountered the Jungian psychoanalyst Ernst Bernard, whose influence on the director will be fundamental from the 1960s on. La Dolce Vita pulls back from the nascent Jungian process that informs Le Notti di Cabiria. Like Il Bidone, La Dolce Vita is about the sustained denial rather than achievement of awakening and awareness, accompanied by anima or soul figures who are either faux, Sylvia, or unacknowledged, Paola. A moment that seems to embody Jungian-style symbolism is the dragging of the lifeless marine monster out of the sea in the final sequence. In psychological terms that meld well with the film's other significations, this would seem to suggest an inability to elevate anything vital from the realm of the unconscious into the light of consciousness. Similarly to Il Bidone, La Dolce Vita offers a world in which, while individual psychology remains arrested, the cultural symbolic is repeatedly undermined, beginning with the statue of Christ whisked toward the Vatican by helicopter. Venerable and resonant Roman sites such as the Basilica Caracalla, St. Peter's Basilica, and the Fontana di Trevi are demystified, as are Rome and the Vatican, as bastions of Western civilization. All right, the third phase that I'm identifying, Jungian person-centered teleological psychology. Fellini encountered Ernst Bernhard around or shortly after the release of La Dolce Vita, and they met thrice weekly until Bernhard's death in 1965. Bernhard introduced Fellini to the depth and range of Jungian archetypal psychoanalysis, encouraged him to keep a dream journal, and supported Fellini's interest in the paranormal, which Fellini begins to explore enthusiastically around the time of 8½. 8½'s Jungian dimension is clearly signaled by the incantatory term asanisi massa, or anima, so central to the film. For the purposes of this talk, the most important aspect of 8½ is its teleological thrust. Guido, through his visionary activity, seems to evolve in his relation to self and world, as his quote-unquote fictions evolve from dreams to triggered memories to fantasies, then to screen tests. Dreams are entirely unconscious, memories are conscious but tied to the past, fantasies are more freely creative than either dreams or triggered memories, and the screen tests represent full conscious invention. Limiting this evolution is the fact that it is all tied to strong ego-centeredness, and the film seems to move beyond private fantasy when the press conference and film launch erupts on screen, and unlike Guido's other Oneiric and imaginative experiences, is not tied to his point of view. A different kind of reality has emerged that combines Guido's superseded subjectivity with the flow of life events, much like the adolescence in Cabiria's final moments seem to reflect her liberated spirit spilled out into the world. This suggests Jungian integration to the point that divisions between subjective and objective disappear, and life itself becomes suffused with consciousness and numinosity. The film's teleological thrust is qualified, however. The ending is not the euphoric vision of people from Guido's life pouring into the circus arena that is so often misconstrued as the ending. That vision dissipates and is followed by the far more melancholic scene of the arena, dark except for a spotlight, gradually emptied of the child Guido, clown musicians, a dog, and the spotlight itself, concluding the film in emptiness and darkness. Here we can see how dark the ending is. The music becomes quite muted as well. We can barely see the figure of the young Guido, who is no longer, his whiteness is no longer visible, and he exits the scene. Despite this sobering coda, 8.5 paves the way for the quintessentially Jungian Fellini film, Giulietta degli Spiriti. As several critics have noted, the film seems to be Fellini's attempt to explore his own anima through the agency of Giulietta, both Fellini's wife and the film protagonist. The film is awash in Jungian apparatus, animus, figures, shadows, archetypes, and the like. Its numinosity consists largely in its proliferation of spirits and psychic events, partially the product of Fellini's explorations in the esoteric. But again, for the purposes of this discussion, the film's most distinctive Jungian attribute is its teleology. The trajectory of Juliet's inner life is similar to Guido's. It's initially fueled by unconscious activity, promptings triggered by a seance, a dream, moves to the conscious activation of memories, the circus, the school play, becomes sustained and disciplined rationality, observation and interpretation, modeled largely by the detective lynx eyes, then evolves into supraconscious activity, the interpenetration of self, spirits, and world in the lawn party and the final scenes of the film. At this point, as with Guido near the end of his story, Juliet's mind and world seem one. In this case, there is no sobering coda. While Cabiria seems to turn the cultural symbolic to her own ends in Le Note di Cabiria, Guido and Giulietta are more involved in acts of repudiation. Institutional religion is either ridiculed or of little assistance to Guido. The cultural myth of woman as purity and spirit turns on Guido when Claudia Cardinale insists that he does not know how to love. In a sense, and somewhat paradoxically, the most profound symbol of the culturally disabling might be Guido's film. Because of his fame and consequent pressures, it is no longer his, but belongs instead to his producer, his assistants, his nihilistic screenwriter Daumier, journalists, press conferences, film launches, and the like. It also becomes a repository of the cultural/symbolic through its reproduction of film genres, science fiction, and especially of cliched symbolism, the salvific, beautiful woman in white. Guido's repudiation of the film becomes a repudiation not only of his failed attempts to merge art and life, but of cultural forms to which he has remained subjected. Giulietta rejects her Catholic and bourgeois background in iconography, refusing to be either the perfect or the adulterous wife, saint or martyr. She even rejects a quasi-Jungian archetypal figure, such as the Great Mother, though her mother is both highly personalized and culturally oppressive, not the richly numinous figure of Jung's collective unconscious. Okay, contesting and complicating Jung. The Jungian teleological phase of Fellini's work is of short duration and seems to end in conjunction with several negative events in the life of the director. In 1965, after the completion of Giulietta degli Spiriti, Ernst Bernhardt died. The film itself was not well received. Fellini experienced a creative crisis in his failed attempt to make Il Viaggio di G. Mastorna. He was confronted with extreme financial difficulties because of taxes and legal entanglements caused by his renunciation of the Mastorna project. Of greatest impact, in 1967, he suffered severe anaphylactic shock and an illness that was initially feared to be cancer. He nearly died on his way to a clinic and then feared for his life until a proper diagnosis and cure were found. Accordingly, Il Viaggio di G. Mastorna is about a figure who dies at the story's outset and gradually comes to discover that he's a spirit adrift in the afterlife. Amidst this confluence of circumstances, Fellini turned definitively away from tales of personal individuation. His next film, Toby Dammit, 1968, has certain resemblances to the death and life vision of the journey of Gima Storna. A Shakespearean actor comes to Rome to make a Catholic Western and ends up dead. While Toby dies as a character or a person, Fellini offers a kind of individuation different from the personal, that of the artwork. The title of the film is Toby's signature, making him the author and teller of the tale. The film begins with his voiceover effectively from beyond the grave. While transcendence seems no longer possible on an individual level for Fellini, the artwork functions as an afterlife for the superseded individual. At the same time, the film is a ritual annihilation of the cultural symbolic. The film's title, riffing off Shakespeare, proclaims that to be, one has to damn it. And what gets damned first and foremost is Toby's role as an actor in the most profoundly metaphorical sense. Someone who plays roles in other people's, that is, culturally determining, scenarios. What Toby damns or rejects in the course of his odyssey is all the forms of social staging to which he is subjected. His professional identity, Rome, Shakespeare, cinema, including a ridiculous award ceremony, and religion in the form not only of the Catholic Western, but of a devil his imagination has constructed as a diametric opposite of Christian notions of the diabolic. The ultimate cultural symbol that gets destroyed is Toby's head. It's difficult to see here, but we can see it on the left. It is a site, like Guido's film, Toby's head does not belong to him, but is possessed by the world around him. It is the site of all the words he's been programmed to speak, all the internalized demands and restraints imposed by others. It is the site, in a sense, not of ego, but of superego. Only by losing his head can he attain some sort of wholeness of being. But given the death of the individualized hero in Fellini's work, that wholeness becomes represented not by personhood, but by art. Something similar happens in The Clowns, but I don't have time to address it right now. All right, the next phase that I'd like to talk about is the post-Jungian or the post-teleological. Fellini's Satyricon carries through on Toby Dammit's dismantling of subjectivity. According to Fellini, quote, the film does not have psychology, does not have characters, unquote. While the film pulls away from Jung on the level of individualized experience, it carries the Jung and Bernhard-inspired Oneiric to new levels. Fellini has described the film as a great dream galaxy and as the documentary of a dream. Satyricon advances Toby's double destruction of both the individual and the social and offers yet a third. Not only do we not have psychologized characters, but an established order represented by figures such as Trimalchio, Eumolpo, and Lycus comes to an end with the overthrow of Caesar and the profoundly symbolic suicide of a patrician couple. Once the older order is gone, new manifestations of authority are infrequent and unattached to a coherent new order. What seems to take the place of both individualism and a dominant social order is a kind of archetypal unconscious, as the protagonists encounter a hermaphrodite, a minotaur, and a fire-giving fertility goddess cum Earth Mother. However, the archetypal unconscious is not a liberating force, the cumulative psychic archive of Jung, but fragmented and dissociated cultural symbolism. Encolpio's encounters with all three figures are unproductive. The Minotaur Ariadne sequence turns literally into a joke in celebration of a festival of mirth. And Encolpio's encounter with the Black Mediterranean Earth Mother is both parody, he's stoned and pathetic, and worse, as he remains oblivious to the murder of his best friend several meters away. As both the individual and the social are decentered as sources of structure and meaning, archetypal symbolism loses its psychic fecundity. And one of the things I'm working towards in my thinking about Fellini is the way in which he begins with certain kind of stable entities like the self, and social, and the archetypal. And in the course of his career, he deconstructs all of them, which opens up his work to a kind of fluidity that it also makes it more difficult, in a sense, to comprehend at certain levels, and it ultimately evolves into a kind of postmodern signification. The sense of art as afterlife reappears, but in a much less comforting and sustained way than in Toby Dammit. In effect, it suffers the same fate as the individual, the social, and the archetypal. The final image of the protagonist in Culpio metamorphoses into a fresco, and as the camera draws back, we see major figures of the film as frescoes on the walls of a ruined villa. Split apart in a landscape that has long survived the villa itself. Art may outlive its creators and subjects, but it too has a shelf life. In moving beyond Jungian teleology, we move into the terrain of post-Jungian psychoanalyst James Hillman. In his Dreams in the Underworld, Hillman asserts that our dreams are enacted in a space akin to the mythological realm of Hades, hence a realm of the dead, a species of afterlife or other life, shades of the shades of Gina Storna and Toby Dammit. Crucial to Hillman, dreams in the underworld are the sites of soul-making, the transformation of the material into the psychically meaningful. In contrast to both Freud and Jung, Hillman claims, quote, "We must sever the link with the day world, foregoing all ideas that originate there," unquote. Neither Freud nor Jung jettisoned the importance of day world consciousness. Hillman also takes issue with the Jungian teleological. Quote, "The underworld teaches us to abandon our hopes for achieving unification of personality by means of the dream. The endless variety of figures reflects the endlessness of the soul, and dreams restore to consciousness this sense of multiplicity. A psychotherapy that reflects these depths can therefore make no attempt at achieving undivided individuality or encouraging a personal identity as unified wholeness. Instead, psychotherapeutic emphasis will be upon the disintegrative effects of the dream, which also confronts us with our moral disintegrity, our psychopathic lack of a central hold on ourselves," unquote. Fellini owned at least 3 of Hillman's books, and as we move into Fellini's later career, his films become far more Hillmanian than Jungian. Rome in 1972 seems to center Fellini as a director seeking to document or portray Rome. However, in keeping with Fellini's Satyricon, a unified central consciousness is undermined. Although our viewing habits incline us to create one persona out of the central child figure in the provinces around 1930, the young adult played by Peter Gonzalez, Rome 1939, and Fellini himself in Rome of 1971. Fellini refuses to identify either the child or the young adult as himself, and I've argued this point in greater detail in my book. Fellini even goes so far as to have his voice dubbed not by him, but by noted impersonator and dubber, Alighieri Noschese. A significant example of Roma's implicit renunciation of Jungian psychology is its failed quest for a center, the blocked-off Colosseum, the subway sequence's disappointing journey to the center of the earth, Anna Magnani's repudiation of Fellini's attempts to turn her into an all-encompassing symbol of Rome. In psychoanalytical terms, such a quest signifies a search for self or individuation. The second example is the dissipation of the frescoes uncovered in the subway sequence as soon as they encounter the light and air of the present. This suggests a failure to elevate crucial aspects of the unconscious to the level of consciousness, much like the dead marine monster in La Dolce Vita and the failed ascent of Venus at the beginning of Il Casanova di Federico Fellini. A third example is Fellini's abandonment, with the aid of Magnani, of his attempts to interpret Rome as a version of the Great Mother. This is a repudiation not only of Jung, but Bernard, to whom the Great Mother was crucial to his somewhat racist, I think, analysis of Italian mamismo. In contrast, the motorcycle ballet that concludes Roma seems to remain faithful to the Hillmanian underworld, emerging from and inhabiting the darkness while its motion and headlights turn all the monuments of Rome into a dreamscape. There is no central consciousness whose pilgrim's progress it fulfills, and it makes no pretense of pulling the camera eye or audience into the light of a new day. Amarcord in 1974, much more so than Roma, turns memory into dreamscape. Almost every scene has a touch of the seemingly numinous. At the same time, the film dissolves personal consciousness even more so than did Roma. The film's title means I remember, but there is no I who remembers. There are several narrators of varying intelligence and insight, as well as scenes independent of voiceover. The act of dreaming or remembering is diffused, not centralized. It is the dream, not the dreamer, that counts. While the diffused oniricism, and I have to use this word oniricism, it doesn't exist, but it should. The diffused oniricism of Roma and Amarcord erodes ego-centered identity. It also produces a fierce critique of the cultural symbolic. At the outset of Roma, Julius Caesar is quickly demythologized. In my typos earlier, I turned Julius Caesar to Juliet Caesar. The Colosseum is presented in Fellini's own words as, quote, a huge skull eaten away by time, unquote. Fascism, as always, is ridiculed, and the ecclesiastical fashion show is a thorough deconstruction of church iconography. The cultural/monumental can only be salvaged by being turned into light and motion, that is, a cinematic dream, by the motorcycle ballet. In Amarcord, public spectacle and social institutions are satirized, but the film also offers a darker view of the way in which they dominate individual consciousness. Submissiveness to fascism and its ostentations is one example, most notably in the passing of the Rex ocean liner. And here I emphasize the passivity rather than the Rex. Radiska's name, freely translated as "Have Your Way with Me," captures the acquiescence and complicity at the heart of Amarcord's world, as does her lighting of the torch for the misogynist burning of the Witch of Winter. Here we can see she's got the match in her hand and she's about to light the torch. And as well, the acquiescence is present in her role as communal sex offering to the prince and her marriage to a pompous carabinieri whose wedding toast is Viva l'Italia. The combination of unwitting acquiescence to dominant culture and oniricism turns the filmscape of Amarcord at times into a kind of alternative collective unconscious, not the archetypal sort envisioned by Jung, but rather the ideological sort proposed by Antonio Gramsci and Louis Althusser. It also suggests that memory in Amarcord is not a prod to psychological development, but the internalizing of the culturally disabling. We remember disabling events, feelings, and so on. The combination of the personal with the cultural leads to what I would term kitsch numinosity, the seemingly mystical and wondrous, tinged with crudeness. We've already seen it in Lo Cieco Bianco. The Rex ocean liner is a perfect case in point here. And I choose kitsch rather than camp for reasons that I won't go into here. Finally, the postmodern, post-personal, post-psychological, and here I'm going to be really brief. Much of the remainder of Fellini's career offers a persistent pseudo-oniricism that is neither grounded in healthy personal psychology nor consistent with a Hellmanian self-regenerating dream activity that transcends ego and self. At times, it seems to derive far more from stylistic deformation grounded in Fellini's caricatural heritage as a satirical cartoonist than from the psychological concerns of the 1950s and 1960s. I characterize some of this depsychologized dream work as the postmodern Oneiric, in which consciousness is produced or at best mimicked by mechanisms of postmodern reproduction. One's psyche and imagination are replaced by postmodern sign systems, for instance, television. The medium becomes the message, and the collective unconscious a mere data bank of prefabricated images and sounds. The disfiguring work of these systems produces a patina of irreality that mimics but effaces the Oneiric. Fellini seems to return to a quasi-Jungian teleological dream trajectory in La Città delle Donne. However, at best, Snaperazzi's creative unconscious is corrective, not individuated. The most it can do is reveal to Snaperazzi the perversity of his masculine disinhibitions and constantly punish him for his behavior toward women. In the end, the film situates equally more in the camp of Freud and of Hillman. In terms of the former, much of Snaperazzi's dreaming reflects neurotic sexual wish fulfillment. In terms of the latter, much stronger than any individuating or even curative function is the lure of Oneiric activity itself. The film begins in dream, and despite his rather terrifying dream experience, Snapperaz, upon waking, chooses to settle back down to sleep. In Hillman's terms, quote, severing the link with the day world, unquote. Intervista and La Voce della Luna seem to share the Oneiric playfulness of La Città delle Donne, allowing Fellini to end his career by partially shedding the postmodern pall that hangs over some of his later work. Intervista offers relentless inventiveness that is at times magical and even numinous, as Fellini confirms that filmmaking is for him the equivalent of ceaseless dream activity. In Hillmanian fashion, it concludes not with an ending, but with Fellini envisioning the start of a new film. However, cinematic reproduction does tend to replace the Oneiric, as Cinecittà serves as the factory of both dreams and memory. Reliving the past means rewatching the Trevi Fountain sequence of La Dolce Vita. La Voce della Luna allows the unconscious free play as the quote-unquote lunacy of the film's Madhouse graduates, places us somewhere between daylight consciousness and the night world darkness of the unconscious. There is nothing teleological going on, and there is a good deal of melancholy to the story. But it is also a celebration of figures whose eccentricity at least has the virtue of turning postmodern Italian society into farce rather than tragedy. And Ivo, despite his disappointing experience with Wells, the underworld, is back seeking their voices at the end. Nonetheless, the films seem to produce unbridgeable schisms among individual, social world, and creative unconscious. And here we have Snapperaz going back to sleep, Fellini starting a new movie, and Ivo, though it's very difficult to see, leaning back to see if he can hear more voices from the well. As we can see then from this tentative and hasty perusal of the Oneiric and Symbolic in Fellini's films, his relationship to dreams and the dreamlike is complex and changeable. Though much of the above might not be strictly applicable to a libro dei sogni, it seems to me a useful point of departure for exploring the depth and range of the Oneiric in that formidable text. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this very extensive overview of this particular trajectory of Fellini's cinema. Okay, great. We're back to the general view. So we have a few minutes for questions or comments. Not sure what you can raise your hand or use the handy icon. That's yes. Juliana Minghelli. You need to unmute. There you go.
I'll start. So I'm sort of taking you to places that you didn't want to touch, but I found it very interesting for my talk today as well on Amarcord. So I wanted to ask you about how were you thinking to bring in the melancholic? And I totally agree with you that it has such a presence, in Fellini, and it should be taken into account. Because once we go to the melancholic, we go to a territory that seems to me, I'm not a Jungian expert, I'm more Freudian, but it brings you toward Freud. It brings you toward the notion of a loss that cannot be, made whole. It cannot be brought back within the subjectivity, reintegrated, and involves a repetition of this loss. So I was wondering if you could say a few words and thinking the direction you were going to move into to bring in this melancholic dimension within the Oneiric as you presented it today.
Yeah, I started to think about this in terms of, certainly loss, lack of fulfillment, disappointment. I think there's so many, and of course, Freud talks about it in terms of melancholy and mourning, in terms of a specific loss and the inability to let go, the inability to mourn, which means that it stays with you, it stays within you, and generates this sense of dis-ease. But I think I was going to look more broadly at all the kinds of things that tend to create melancholy for us, but obviously in this case specifically Fellini, but also looking at the way in which it seems to me, and Hillman really talks about this, that leaving the day world behind, constantly working the dream world in terms of what he calls soul making, is a kind of renunciation. And Fellini's sort of Oneiric work is also a kind of renunciation of engagement that to me creates melancholy. It creates a sense of loss. It creates a sense of not being fully present to the world. So I wanted to look more deeply at the way in which an Oneiric sensibility inevitably generates a certain kind of melancholy. The other thing I wanted to look at, or see it connected to as well, is that Fellini's caricatural, his caricatures, that he starts out as a caricaturist and he always is a caricaturist. And that seems to me also to suggest a certain dis-ease at being present to the world, that one needs to deform it and transform it. So it seems to me that fundamental to the way in which he sees and deforms the world is a sense of, it's an element of alienation, a desire, I mean, because there's no filmmaker who's got more moments of joy in his work, like the scene in 8½, where everybody comes down into the circus arena. But there's also, but underlying that is a sense that joy cannot be sustained. And again, that's something that I was trying to say, that I did say very briefly in 8½, is that movement from euphoria to melancholy at the end of 8½ is an example of Fellini's recognition, particularly as he became more mature, that as he said in his interview, in one of his interviews with Charlotte Chandler, happiness doesn't last. And she says to him in an interview, well, you're happy now. And he says, yeah, I'm happy now, but I won't be in a few minutes. But then I'll be happy again. So epiphanies don't, I think what I'm trying to get at is that Fellini at a certain point was kind of an epiphanic director. He loved, in the Jungian phase of his work, he loved the idea that we could arrive at moments of epiphany. But that brings with it the dark side, the fact that the epiphany doesn't last. And then another dimension of melancholia is, of course, the creative temperament of having the energy of creating, but also the terror that one is not going to be able to create anymore. So there were a million different things that I was trying to kind of explore melancholy in relation to. So, and I wish I could have done it today. I'm melancholic because I couldn't do it today.
You know that you'll be able to do it another time, so that will make you happy.
There you go. Thank you. All right. Another epiphany.
Daniela? You have to unmute Daniela.
Okay. Just very short question. Don't you think, Frank, that this, desire, this activity of caricaturing, everything he drew, shows an insecurity to cope with reality, though?
Exactly. That's exactly what I was trying.
Okay. That was all. I wanted to make sure that we were on the same page. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Heather McIntyre. You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Perfect.
So just a question about Nights of Cabiria. I think your comment was that during the mesmerist scene that Cabiria descends into or engages with an Ur identity. I'm just wondering to what extent that identity that she discovers in that descent is itself a kind of dream, a kind of construct, because the mesmerist constructs this scenario for her from her past, where she is always her eyes are always downcast. She's always going to mass with her mother, etc. It's a very idealistic scenario of innocence and purity, etc. But later, when she's with Oscar at the trattoria, she will begin speaking almost uncontrollably about her past, how she came to be a prostitute. And one of the things she'll say is that my mother just wanted the money. So there's a kind of disjunct between that image that she fantasizes with of her pure and innocent past, and the reality which emerges in this moment when she thinks she's going to be married and she's going to escape all of this past. And the reality is that at the age of 15, her mother was very happy to have the money from her prostitution. So I'm wondering if that what she discovers in the what she discovers on stage is something that the mesmerist has jointly constructed with her, a fantasy of an idealized childhood or an idealized innocence of childhood.
No question. No. I mean, that's a part of her development. It gives her the courage. That sort of false identity gives her the courage to then get involved with Oscar. But then what becomes, as you're saying, perfect is so clearly that she then has to grow up again beyond that childish and perfect and sort of Catholic virginal identity, which she does, because by the end, one of the things, I mean, she almost gets killed again.
Yeah.
And then when the last images we see of her are not only a smile, but tears. And the mascara is running down her face. And that mascara signifies her existence still, or her carrying her with herself, her identity as a prostitute. So she has it all together in the final shots of the film. And the young woman who turns around to her with long dark hair and says, "Buonasera," that's Maria.
Yes, that's it.
So I think you're absolutely right. We're not yet where Fellini wants to take us, or where Cabiria needs to go. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true. It's a false identity, but it enables her to reconnect with a sense of possibility about herself that she lost. But that's not the end of the journey in the film.
And I think it's there's a wonderful sort of complicated irony in that as well, because when Oscar approaches her after the magic act, his way of speaking about it, about how moved he was and the purity that he saw in her, etc., I think very much fits with the viewers' response to it too, there's something of truth in that we respond to so emotionally. And so when he can betray her after, there's a terrible irony there that he could perceive something like that in her and still wish to destroy it, or that it is not enough to move him to abandon his plans to betray her and perhaps murder her. I think seems to me a lovely melancholy irony in there.
I mean, I don't take him seriously even then, because I think he's just playing along with her.
Yeah.
The thing that where her power really comes through to me is when the conjurer has to stop the act. He realizes, he's gone too far. Or I don't know. I can't control this anymore. Her power greater than what I can handle. So that's where her authentic. Oscar, I'm not quite too inclined to believe, but what you're saying is also true.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. We are almost right on time. So I think maybe we'll stop here for now. Of course, individual conversations can continue in the breakout room if you wish, for which I'll let our technical staff make arrangements, because I wouldn't know the next thing about it. In any case, so now we can take a short break or for breakout rooms and whatnot, and we'll meet again in 10 minutes at 10:45.